So today I want to talk about something I think gets really overlooked in the attachment world, which is temperament, because sometimes we are so quick to label everything as attachment, right? You want more alone time, that's avoidant. You want more reassurance, that's anxious. You don't text very much, that's avoidant. You're highly sensitive to someone's mood changing, that's anxious. But what if some of these differences aren't necessarily attachment wounds? What if some of them are simply you, right? Your temperament, your personality, your energy level, your sensitivity, your need for stimulation or lack of it, your natural way of moving through the world. And more importantly, what happens when your temperament interacts with your attachment wounds? Because I think this is where relationships can get really, really confusing, right? Two people can actually be doing a lot of attachment work and still experience friction because their baseline temperaments are fundamentally different. So today, we're going to talk about the difference between attachment and temperament, right? How temperament can make us appear more anxious or avoidant, how two people's temperaments can activate attachment wounds in each other, and how to figure out what actually needs healing versus what simply just needs understanding and acceptance. And I really want to address this because I see it not only in my own life, but constantly with the couples that I work with, right? You have two very different people. And yes, oftentimes they have opposing attachment styles. One may lean more anxious, one may lean more dismissive or fearful, avoidant. And let's just say that one partner has a genuine need for space, right? Maybe they're naturally more introverted, they're quiet, they're independent, they're internally focused, and the other partner wants to feel secure in the relationship. So they interpret that need for space as distancing. But quite often, this is simply just how that person naturally is, right? The anxious partner then creates a narrative around rejection or abandonment, while the more avoidant partner begins to feel pressured. And even worse, like who they fundamentally are isn't accepted by their loved one. And you can see how quickly disconnection and misunderstanding builds, right? Yes, both can absolutely make strides towards supporting each other's needs. The more independent partner can stretch towards connection, while the more relational partner can learn to tolerate space without automatically interpreting it as rejection. But I think there's another question we don't talk about enough. At what point are two people's temperaments simply not compatible enough for the relationship to feel sustainable? Because if our natural temperaments continually activate each other's deepest attachment wounds, there may be a point where we're asking both people to stretch so far that neither person can really feel like themselves anymore. So we can't just look at attachment. We also have to ask whether who these two people are, naturally can work well together. So first, what is temperament? Temperament is essentially our natural predisposition towards certain ways of experiencing and responding to the world, right? Some people are naturally more sensitive, more intense, more cautious, more social, more spontaneous, more structured, more emotionally expressive, more internally focused, more easily stimulated, more adaptable. And we can see differences in temperament very easily in life, right? You can put two babies in exactly the same environment and they can respond completely differently, right? One baby might be perfectly content being passed around a room full of people. Another baby might become completely overwhelmed. And that doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong, right? Their nervous systems are just simply processing the environment very differently. And we carry those differences into adulthood, right? Attachment is different. Attachment is largely about what we've learned to expect from relationships. So, can I depend on people? Will people leave me? Will my needs be met? Is closeness safe? Do I have to earn love? Will someone consume me if I let them get too close, right? Those beliefs develop through our relational experiences. And that's why attachment can change. But, we can also have corrective experiences. We can challenge our beliefs around love. We can regulate our nervous systems. We can learn healthier communication. We can become more securely attached. But becoming securely attached doesn't mean we all become the same person, right? Security doesn't erase temperament. And I think that's incredibly important. Your temperament can amplify your attachment style. So imagine, someone who naturally has a very sensitive nervous system. They're observant, They notice subtle shifts in people's facial expressions. They notice changes in tone. They notice when someone's texting style changes. Now, combine that temperament with an anxious attachment wound around abandonment, right? Suddenly that sensitivity becomes hypervigilance. Something changed. They're quieter today. Why didn't they say good morning the way they normally do? Are they pulling away? Their temperament gave them the ability to notice the change. Their attachment wound gave the change meaning. And that's the distinction, right? A secure person with that same sensitive temperament might notice, they seem quieter today. And then they think, well, maybe they're just tired. Or maybe they might ask, hey, you seem a little off today. Is everything okay? The sensitivity isn't necessarily the problem, the interpretation is. And we can see the same thing with avoidance, right? Imagine someone who naturally has a very independent temperament. They love spending time alone. They get absorbed in projects. They're spontaneous. They don't need constant communication. They enjoy having a lot of internal space. None of those things automatically make someone avoidant, but combine that temperament with an attachment wound around engulfment or loss of autonomy, and independence can become distancing, right? A partner starts to ask, can we spend more time together? And instead of simply hearing a request for connection, their nervous system hears, you're trying to control me, right? I'm going to lose my freedom. Nothing I do is ever enough. This relationship is becoming too much. Again, the temperament isn't necessarily the wound, but the wound can weaponize the temperament as protection. So this is where couples can really, really misunderstand each other. One person might naturally be highly relational. They love talking throughout the day. They like routines. They enjoy checking in. They feel connected through frequent communication. Their partner might naturally be much more free-flowing. They're absorbed in whatever they're doing. Their energy changes. Sometimes they're incredibly social, and sometimes they want to disappear into their own world for a few hours. Neither person is necessarily unhealthy, but now put attachment wounds underneath those temperaments, and the relational person starts to think, well, why are they different today? Their anxious attachment activates. They start to pursue, they start asking, are you okay? Are we okay? You seem different. And the more independent person experiences those questions as scrutiny. Their avoidant wound gets triggered. Why am I constantly being monitored? Why can't I just exist in the world? They become defensive or they withdraw. Now, the anxious person's nervous system says, see, something is wrong. So they pursue more. And the avoidant person's nervous system says, see, relationships are actually suffocating. So they distance more. And suddenly, two temperament differences have become an attachment cycle. And this has been a really important realization for me personally. I've had relationships where there was a tremendous amount of independence. I could wander around, I could do my thing, I could change my plans, I could be quiet, get absorbed into something, and there wasn't much reaction to it. There was a lot of freedom, and I loved that. But over time, I also realized that something was missing for me. I wanted more involvement, more emotional connection, more engagement, more of a sense of us. Then I experienced the opposite, a relationship with much more involvement, much more communication, much more attention, more emotional attunement, someone wanting to be deeply integrated into my life. And suddenly the thing I thought I wanted could sometimes feel like it was too much. And that taught me something really important, right? That sometimes we're searching for this imaginary person who will somehow give us maximum connection and maximum independence simultaneously. Someone deeply involved who just never requires anything from us. Someone who is emotionally available, who never notices when we're distant, someone who prioritizes the relationship but never interprets our autonomy. And relationships don't really work like that. Every temperament comes with something. A highly independent partner may give you tremendous freedom, but you may sometimes wish they were more involved. A highly relational partner may give you incredible emotional connection, but they may require more consideration and communication from you. A spontaneous person may bring lots of excitement, but perhaps less predictability. A structured partner may bring stability, but perhaps less flexibility. A highly sensitive partner may understand you deeply, but may also notice things, you'd rather they didn't notice. And there's no temperament without trade-offs, right? And I think maturity in relationships is partly recognizing which trade-offs actually work for you. Not how do I find someone who never inconveniences me. So this is also why compatibility matters. Attachment theory can sometimes accidentally give us the impression that every relationship problem is something we should heal through. And I don't believe that's true. Sometimes two people are just simply very different. And security can help those differences tremendously, but security doesn't necessarily erase them. If one person wants to spend 7 nights a week together and another genuinely prefers 3, we can regulate all day long, but at some point, there still needs to be a conversation, right? Can we find a middle ground? And more importantly, can both of us live happily in that middle ground? Because compromise isn't, one person gets what they want and the other learns to tolerate it. Healthy compromise means we create something both people can genuinely live with. So how do you know if something is temperament or attachment? And I think one of the best questions is, what happens when I feel safe? When you're not triggered, when you're not afraid of abandonment, when you're not afraid of losing yourself, when you're not trying to protect yourself, who are you naturally? Maybe you're still someone who loves a lot of alone time, and that's okay. Secure attachment doesn't mean becoming incredibly relational. Maybe you're still someone who loves affection and frequent communication. That's okay too. Secure attachment doesn't mean becoming hyper independent. So the goal isn't to change your temperament. The goal is to remove enough fear that you can actually see your temperament clearly. Another question is this preference flexible, right? Temperament usually allows some flexibility. You might prefer alone time, but you can make room for connection without, feeling threatened. Or you might prefer frequent communication, but you can tolerate your partner being unavailable without spiraling. Attachment wounds tend to create rigidity, right? I need you to text me, or I need you to leave me alone. One is pursuing safety through closeness. The other is pursuing safety through distance. So security gives us more flexibility. And another really important question I want you to ask yourself is, what story am I attaching to their difference? Maybe your partner wants more connection than you. Does that automatically mean they're needy, controlling, or dependent? Or maybe your partner wants more space, right? Does that automatically mean that they're avoidant or uninterested or emotionally unavailable? Sometimes difference is just difference. And when we stop pathologizing every difference, can we actually start negotiating? And so this is where values becomes incredibly important, because our feelings will always fluctuate, right? Our attachment systems fluctuate, our moods fluctuate, but our values give us direction. And this is something I focus strongly on in my coaching practice, is really just helping people define and align with their value system, because it creates a really beautiful blueprint to follow. So instead of asking, which relationship makes me feel less triggered, ask yourself, what kind of relationship actually aligns with my values, right? Do I value partnership? Do I value adventure, independence, family, emotional intimacy, growth, stability, affection, friendship, spiritual closeness? And then ask yourself, what kind of temperament would complement those values, right? Because the person who triggers you the least isn't automatically the person who's the best for you. Sometimes we're least triggered by people who simply just don't get close enough to activate anything. And that isn't necessarily security, right? Sometimes that's just distance. And here's another piece that I think is really important. Your ideal partner doesn't necessarily need to have your temperament, okay? Sometimes complementary temperaments are beautiful. I've talked before about the image of dancing. I want to be able to dance, to move, to explore, to fluctuate. And perhaps my ideal partner doesn't need to dance exactly the same way. Maybe they're the grounded base. They don't panic when I move. They don't interpret every fluctuation as rejection. but they're also emotionally present enough that I don't feel like I'm dancing alone. And I think that's the balance many of us are actually looking for. Not someone exactly like us, but someone whose temperament allows us to be ourselves without consistently activating our deepest attachment wounds. And someone whose needs we're genuinely capable of meeting without abandoning ourselves. Because here's the truth, every relationship will require something from you, even the most compatible one. You will have to communicate when you don't feel like communicating. You will sometimes have to reassure someone. You will sometimes have to give space when you want closeness. You will sometimes have to change your plans, right? You'll sometimes consider another person's needs before your own preferences. And that doesn't necessarily mean self-abandonment. That's partnership. The question is whether you're occasionally stretching or chronically abandoning yourself. Those are very different experiences. So if you're trying to understand your relationship right now, I want you to stop asking only, what's my attachment style? And start asking, what's my temperament? Who am I when I'm regulated? How much connection naturally feels good to me, right? How much independence do I need? How much structure do I need? How much spontaneity do I like? How emotionally expressive am I? How sensitive am I? What environments energize me? What environments drain me? And then ask yourself, where does my attachment wound exaggerate those qualities, right? Maybe you're naturally independent, but avoidance turns independence into isolation. Maybe you're naturally sensitive, but anxiety turns sensitivity into hypervigilance. Maybe you're naturally spontaneous, but fear turns compromise into feeling controlled. Or maybe you're naturally relational, but abandonment wounds turns connection into reassurance seeking, right? That's the work. It's not eliminating who you are. It's just separating who you are from what fear taught you to become. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of becoming securely attached, right? You don't become less of yourself. You actually become of yourself because there's less fear contaminating your personality, right? You can want closeness without clinging. You can want independence without disappearing. You can be sensitive without assuming. You can be spontaneous without disregarding your partner. You can be structured without controlling them. That's the secure self, as I like to call it, right? Not a perfectly regulated person, not someone who never gets triggered, but someone who increasingly knows this is who I am, this is what I need, this is what I value, and this is the part of me that's afraid. And when we can separate those things, right, we stop letting attachment wounds define our personality. We stop labeling every incompatibility as trauma. And we stop expecting healing to turn our partner or ourselves into someone we're fundamentally not. Instead, we become more capable of choosing relationships from clarity, not just chemistry, right? Not just attachment activation, not just relief, but compatibility, values, and temperament. And love, if you're ready to understand your attachment patterns on a deeper level and start learning how to respond from your secure self, you can book a free clarity call with me to learn about attachment coaching via the link in the show notes. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Keep asking yourself, what would secure me do? And I'll catch you on the next episode.